Mark Darley is the Chief Operating Officer for Lloyd's Register, one of the world's leading classification societies, and it'd be interesting to hear his particular perspective on this key topic.
Morning, everybody. It really is a pleasure to join you this morning here in Dubai and really build on some of the interesting comments that we've heard already this morning. I'd too like to extend my thanks to Trevor, Clive, the Maritime Standard team for the opportunity to talk to you this morning. Now, at Lloyd's Register, I'm going to represent the regulatory view, but at LR, across the group, between our classification business and our digital solutions and advisory businesses, we provide solutions to about half of the world's IMO fleet. And increasingly, those solutions, as you might imagine, over the last 5-6 years have been solutions that focus on the energy transition. So as well as asking my own questions, hopefully I'll provide some answers as well from what we've heard this morning. But I'll start really by taking us all back to our school days. And those of you that remember English literature will remember that Shakespeare once asked a very famous question, and that was, to be or not to be. Now, I think if Shakespeare was a ship owner in 2023, he might be asking the question, to retrofit or replace? That is the question. And to think about the why to that question, I'll really take us back to what happened in MEPC 80 back in July. So back in July, really, MEPC 80 and the IMO had no option, really, but to strengthen the industry's commitment to carbon reduction since the original 2018 short-term measures. Now, since 2018, we have seen a lot of development. We've seen the first methanol deep-sea fueled ships. We've seen delivery of LNG-fueled VLCCs. We've seen the use of carbon capture systems on board. We've seen hydrogen being used to propel vessels around the world. And we've seen the development of two-stroke engines fitted to what will become the first ammonia deep-sea fueled ship in 2026. So I think it's fair to say that the decisions that the IMO made last July will only, or have only, sped up the adoption of non-fossil fuel forms of vessel propulsion and indeed the energy transition as a whole. So let's look at where particularly the tankers are in that energy transition. As it currently stands, we've certainly seen ordering improve substantially year to date in 2023, with around 260 new builds currently on order by September, and that's a rise of 72% year on year. And that's a trend that's expected to continue within the tanker segment, at least for the next 18 months. Now, there's a growing uptake, as has already been mentioned this morning, of alternative fuels in that order book, with increasing fuel optionality. And again, we've started to see a number of LNG-fueled and methanol-fueled orders more recently. Some 33% of the tanker order book is alternative fuel, ready or capable, and that compares, as you can see here, to just 1.8% of the existing propelled fleet. So crude carriers are having the highest alternative fuel order book share at 42%, with oil and chemical tankers somewhere between 25% and 30%, respectively. Overall, however, there are some other very interesting dynamics when we look specifically within the tanker fleet. We know that the global tanker fleet is aging and needs to be replaced. And despite a recent flurry in ordering, particularly in the Afra and LR2 sizes, the order book had reached a historic low, or a 25-year historic low, down to 3%. Against this backdrop, there's other interesting factors as well at play in this sector. And the supply of new vessels is limited when the demand to tankers is expected to grow. And equally important is the fact that if we look at the MRV data today, there's currently 84% of the fleet that will need to do something to achieve CII-C or higher by 2030. And in fact, when we put all these factors together, some estimates that there'll be up to 68% of the current tanker fleet will be over the age of 20 by 2025. And that generates significant fleet replacement conundrums for the industry. But what and when should tanker owners be ordering? Now, unfortunately, as we've heard many times before, there is no easy decision. There are becoming more definitive narratives in terms of what fuel options owners should go for in various sectors. On the what to order, when it comes to future-proofing or at least providing some levels of flexibility to fuel selection, I'd like to refer to a recent report that Lloyd's Register published back in September this year that explored 25 fuel mix projections. The report was called The Future of Maritime Fuels. Now, broadly within this report, there are two conclusions in terms of two pathways that will be generated going forward. The first of those pathways is a bio pathway. And by bio pathway, we mean biodiesel, liquefied biomethane, biomethanol, and this will emerge as having significant adoption within the maritime industry. In fact, liquefied biomethane potentially accounting for 34% market share from a fuel selection perspective by 2050. The second scenario was a scenario based around a hydrogen fuel-based scenario. Now, it's important to add here that this is hydrogen as a fuel stock for ammonia generation and ammonia burning, but equally hydrogen for propulsion as well itself. So under that hydrogen fuel-based scenario, with e-ammonia emerging as the most widely adopted maritime fuel, e-ammonia would account for 35% by 2050. So the report there with those percentages concludes that there will be no one dominant fuel. In fact, no one fuel achieves over 50% adoption. And despite the recent trends that we've seen with the methanol uptake and the methanol ordering, by 2050, methanol as a maritime transportation fuel only achieves an 8% adoption in the energy transition. So this brings me back to Shakespeare and back to the focus of this presentation, to retrofit or replace. Now, as we saw in the earlier slide, there are currently 616 tankers on order. A third of those are alternative fuel, be that ready or be that capable. And well, the first thing to note is if building, there's a lack of the slot availability that Ibrahim has already mentioned. Post-pandemic, global shipbuilding went from a 30-year low to a 10-year high in the space of 12 months. Initially, on the buoyant effects of the container ship market, but then more recently we've seen the LNG ordering leaving limited slot availability. In fact, slot availability in major yards in China and Korea now being 2027. Now, despite this, we've seen an update in the ordering for tankers, and tankers that are also looking to design for the future. This year, for example, we've seen a number of MR tankers of both LNG and methanol readiness. And whilst there is some skepticism around ammonia, as I explained, ultimately, for many, it is the fuel of the future, particularly in its E derivative, and we'll see the first ammonia deep sea fuel tanker in 2026. But I also think one of the least talked about facts when it comes to building a new ship is the total carbon emissions associated with actually building a vessel. Yes, now we have green steel, but when you add together the production, the supply chain, and the associated new build itself, you actually quickly come to the conclusion that keeping the vessel longer than the industry norm of 15 years, could play a significant factor in reducing the emissions by 2050. So as I say, with the major yards effectively full until 2027, questions on availability and an aging fleet and the charter party agreements reluctant to change from the younger tonnage that's used today. What about retrofitting? So there's many advantages and disadvantages and considerations when it comes to retrofitting, and some of them I've listed here. The obvious main advantage is that owners can make decisions when the options are more mature and have a more concrete supply and charter agreements in place. But meanwhile, similar to new build, retrofit require yard space. Now, LR recently published a retrofit report, and in that report it identified in reality, globally, there are only around 15 yards that are capable of handling alternative fuel retrofits. Now, comparing this against the number of potential retrofit candidates for methanol and ammonia, it's clear that with only 15 yards, that capacity would need to be increased significantly to fulfill the potential demands as interest in conversions increases. And bear in mind as well that that repair capacity is already constrained, and adding fuel retrofits on top of that will place further pressure on slots, potentially resulting in longer lead times and higher conversion costs. Now, as many of you will know, the key to a successful retrofit project is the project integration, with the design, the yards, the OEMs, the suppliers, all coming together in unity to ensure the project is planned and delivered to time, to budget. And hence, as an industry, we need to get much better at delivering turnkey solutions if we're going to meet the retrofit demand. Now, I've spoken a bit about what the demand might look like there. So what would the demand look like? So this screen shows one of the three scenarios modeled within that retrofit guide that I mentioned. And we're talking about the entire fleet here, not only tankers. And that demand could be as high as 13,000 vessels by 2036. Now, according to that model, the retrofit demand will peak between 2031 and 2033. So we haven't got a long time as an industry to really understand how we scale and make retrofitting sustainable. Now, our tanker experts within that report suggest that retrofits will not only prevail in this sector over others, but that retrofits within the tanker sector may pick up even sooner, between 2027 and 2028. And for tankers, we also expect to see more retrofits after 2030, when that aging fleet dynamic that I spoke about earlier kicks in, and when the future fuels, given the tanker trades, become even more available. So a few final thoughts before I finish. As I said, MEPC 80 and the outcomes have certainly accelerated what we already started to see since 2018. Yards, whether it's retrofit yards or whether it's new build yards, are already struggling with capacity, and unless we do something, we'll continue to struggle with capacity. So back to my Shakespeare ship owner, retrofit or replace? That is the question. Thank you.